I'm Andy Schmuckler, and I'm doing a series here to try to convey a better human story, an integrative vision about our species. One which I claimed previously, I say, in all sincerity, though with some trepidation, because I know how it sounds, might help human civilization survive. This video, I really hope that I can do justice to what the foundational idea behind of this whole thing. Foundational, both in the sense that this is the idea that started me on my life's mission, hit me like a ton of bricks in 1970, led to my writing and publishing that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes. It's foundational in a sense it's the beginning, but it's also foundational in that most of the other ideas that are part of this integrative vision that are not contained in that first big idea, nonetheless build upon it. In some sense, they derive from it, in the same sense that a mathematician might say from some mathematical statement that you can go from there to the next step and derive from the first to the next, and eventually you've solved for X. So it's also one which I find particularly challenging to do in this format of YouTube video, which I like to use as a conversational, somewhat informal and improvisational way of communicating. I'm just being, me in a spontaneous way, as opposed to the craft in which I was trained to begin with, which is writing and laying things out in a systematic way. The thing about this idea is that what differentiates it, as I see it, from ideas, oh yeah, there are lots of ideas out there, is that when this is laid out clearly and systematically, it's actually compelling. I mean, I've worked with this thing for over half a century now, and there really is no way out. I mean, it's not like 100% it drives all the horses into the corral, but the great bulk of them have to go there. So I hope that if this way of presenting this to you doesn't compel you to the conclusion that, yeah, this is what it means to become a civilization creating species, and it is inevitable. I hope you'll check it out. I'll put links to places where I've written it because, man, there's no idea that I've worked harder to try to lay out clearly in not so many words. I got my doctorate doing this idea, and I wrote a 1,600-page version as my dissertation, and my committee thought it was a major piece of work. This is at Berkeley, and then by happenstance, I was well, it's an interesting story, but my life story. Anyway, I boiled it down to that big book, and now I've boiled it down a whole lot further, and I'm going to try to lay it out for you. This is the idea that I say essentially proves. I know that's a strong word, and it's a little too strong. But effectively, compellingly demonstrates, maybe a slightly more modest and more accurate way. It basically proves a couple of things. And one of them is, and this is the title that I gave the idea when I posted a series about this better human story on 3 Quarks Daily that invited me to offer my ideas for a while. And that is this: the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. That's what I hope you're going to say. Yeah, that follows from what you proved. Okay. The other idea, and it's in a way another angle at the same fundamental truth, is that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, if there are some, and I'm betting there are plenty, but what do I know about that? That steps across onto the path of civilization, any civilization creating creature, will inevitably be compelled to trace a social evolutionary path, a history as tormented and destructive as what human history has been these last 5 to 10 to 12,000 years, however you want to lay out the timeline. 12,000 years is the beginnings, some people say 10,000 years of human beings starting to invent their way of life. 5,000 years is a number I picked because that's when, in very, roughly when full-blown civilizations come into existence, or at least that's from when I studied this stuff intensively in the 1970s, writing that dissertation. 5,000 years, we've got empires in the Tigris, Euphrates, and in Egypt having fully emerged. The other 4 places where civilization emerged, India, China, Mesoamerica, and Peru, they're somewhat later, but you can see empires emerging in that general range. And they all show a social evolutionary force that's driving things in a direction that people couldn't avoid, but didn't choose. And so any creature on any planet is going to be subject to the same consequences of taking the step onto the path of civilization. I am somewhat mystified that there hasn't been more attention over the last century and a half. Well, I'm not sure if that's the right for this one. And I'm not going to take your time for me to think it through, but I'm not sure that we've given, I am sure we haven't looked at that moment in the history of life, in the history of our species, of starting to invent our own way of life, as being as significant a point of departure as it should have been obvious it would be. I mean, life developed on this planet for 3.5 billion years, with living systems all shaped by natural selection. Why wouldn't you think, wow, this is a unprecedented thing that's happening here? We've got a creature here that has evolved in a particular niche and is extricating itself from that niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. And that is my definition of civilization. I think it is the most useful definition. Those societies created by a creature that has extricated itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. That's my definition of civilization. So the point of departure, it's a gradual process that accelerates. The point of departure is People people are starting to grow under their own control. Some of the plants that they used to gather during the long hunter-gatherer stage, which goes back into our primate history, you might say they were hunters and gatherers. So that instead of gathering the plants, they cultivated them in gardens, say. And they're inventing also their own way of life some of the animals that they used to hunt, they're now gathering into herds under their own control. The herding life, the gardening life, eventually the farmer's life. These are unprecedented kinds of things. They're not shaped by natural selection. Natural selection had created a brain that could do that, but it was the brain of the creative, intelligent creature that was inventing a new way of life. Before that, our ancestors had culture. That was important. They were very human. But their way of life, even though they had language and fire and stuff, fundamentally continuous with the way of life of their hunter-gatherer, their primate ancestors, the same general size of a band, same general structure of families and alliances and whatever, uh, and the same basic way of subsistence on what nature spontaneously provides. So that's really pretty fundamental that they hadn't extricated themselves from the niche in which they had evolved biologically until they started controlling the nature they had previously fit into. And I think that, maybe the reason people haven't looked at that juncture well enough is, first of all, like when I was a kid, when people look back, they were still thinking like the beginning is like the ancient world, the pharaohs, Egypt, and the various empires of Mesopotamia. So that's the beginning, or even Greece, and and the Hebrews. That's the beginning. You know, that's not the right timeline, but that was sort of what people had in their heads. And it was also not really part of, I'm kind of guessing here. I think that the evolutionary point of view had not yet generated into the larger mind and a concept of the extraordinary thing that the evolution of life had created. I mean, living things are really fantastic when you get to looking at how they're put together. I mean, it took till 1 billion years ago to create a single cell of the kind that make us up. Like life was evolving for 3.5 billion years, and 2.5 billion years required. I mean, every little molecule is sort of organized in a particular way that's been selected for. And all the way up to a continuous process of selection, choosing from all the varieties that sort of emerge, choosing very non-randomly what it is that can perpetuate itself and the system of which it is a part. It was only in the late 1960s that people really started thinking in a widespread way about environmental concerns. So maybe that was it. But the natural order from the level of the cell all the way up to the level of the biosphere, and there are a variety of levels in between, are extraordinarily intricately put together into an order. I mean, the order can get disrupted at any time from outside the living system. You know, the life sort of, to personify it, is sort of striving to control things, to perpetuate itself. But it doesn't control everything. It doesn't control whether there's an asteroid that's going to hit the planet and wipe out most of the species of that moment 66 million years ago. You know, life is trying to create order in a universe that in which there's a lot of stuff that's not under the control of any kind of order that's life-serving. You know, volcanoes can produce a sort of like the equivalent of a nuclear winter that causes a lot of destruction. North America and South America on their various tectonic plates can float together and join at the isthmus and plunge a couple of separate, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, systems of life. You know, different animals, the placentals of South America, suddenly in competition with the, what are we, the marsupials of South America in competition with the placentals of North America, which worked out mostly not so well for the marsupials. But there are things that happen because most of the cosmos isn't under the control of life. But life, ice ages come and go. That's another example. But life is basically working to create order all the time by choosing what survives over what doesn't in a very non-random way. The line I've been liking to use to capture what's true about the natural order, because it captures both the complete opportunism of the evolutionary process with the wholeness that it tends to create. That the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. And the image I used in the parable of the tribes was that when the wolf falls upon the lamb, that is an injury to the lamb. Nature is red in tooth and claw. But the injury that wolf inflicts on that lamb is not a pattern of an injury to lamb kind, I say, being cute, but is part of the pattern of survival, not just for the wolves, but for the sheep as well. Because if you get rid of the wolves, and we've seen this, like the problems in Yellowstone, if you get rid of the predator, the sheep will overgraze, and pretty soon the grass foundations of the sheep living in that world will be destroyed, and the sheep will be driven toward extinction or whatever. So there's a synergy because of the selection for viability. Now, if you look at the step onto the path of civilization in that context, that for the first time in the history of life, you've got a species, because it's got the highest level of creative intelligence that life had ever managed to produce. I mean, the chimpanzees may have a little bit of culture, they're using tools to get termites. But nothing like we started off down the road to being, wherever you want to, whether it's cooking our food so we can get bigger brains, developing language, starting to write paintings, do paintings on walls. The exact timeline is unclear, at least to me, but I think for at least 700,000 years we've been on a track of becoming more and more creative in defining what our life is going to be, and then we take a step of an unprecedented kind that changes the whole situation, not continuous with our primate past anymore. This is breaking out of the natural order. We control things we used to simply interact with on naturally selected terms. We have left that natural order where there's all that synergy, where the interaction between wolf and lamb, or lion and zebra and grass, where they have all been selected so that they constitute an order, which makes sure that the interactions add up to something which works in the service of what's being selected for, which is basically life over death. Leaving that order, human beings inevitably, but unwittingly, entered into a situation where there would be disorder. There would be nothing to regulate how these different new kind of entities would interact. And it was inevitable that they would be having to interact. It's noteworthy and relevant, but it wouldn't even be necessary. But from my study of the archaeology and anthropology and all that, it appears that wherever civilization emerged in its pristine form, meaning not transplanted from someplace else, but growing out of the local world as it had existed into a world in which eventually, there are empires in those 6 places I mentioned before. In every one of them, the original constellation was that there were these different civilizing groups of people, different cultures or whatever. I don't know how different the cultures were, whether they shared any cultural system. I'm imagining a lot of difference between them. Anyway, in clusters, like in the Nile Valley or something like that. You go back far enough and you get to hunting gathering peoples, but you go back a little less far and you get to societies that are beginning to be on this trail of on the path of civilization, becoming horticultural, various varieties of small scale things with more settled, not just nomadic. Anyway, clusters, and each of them, what we in the political science biz would call sovereign entities. In other words, they're not under any kind of governing structure, and they're having to interact with each other because it's also because each of them, as they're inventing their own way of life and making certain kinds of progress, they're each developing a greater and greater ability to to expand. It's not, there's a sense of territory that would emerge, and there would be societies cheek by jowl, each of whom had the ability to become larger, but are interacting around the fact that they're in a finite space. And even if it hadn't been that all these things had happened with societies being in clusters, eventually what emerges is these empires. So if you've got these different worlds, like you read about in in the Bible, as one very rich portrait of the world, the ancient world, and how things worked, like a people being enslaved in one of the world's great empires for 400 years, and different tribes encountering each other in the land of Canaan, and all that stuff, and people being overrun by the Philistines. It's a picture of the way the world was, and it was analogous in all the other places. I mean, you look at China and the warring states periods, and what you find is at every stage, it appears, societies were having to deal with each other. And they would deal with each other in a way that was totally unregulated. It wasn't regulated by nature, and it wasn't regulated by humans. In other words, it wasn't part of that lion, lamb, grass kind of scheme. And there was no way that there could be a human designed order when they're so fragmented, when, it's not like all these little empires, or even big empires, had any chance to get together and create some enforceable order that gives everybody some kind of optimal possibilities. Instead, you've got this disorder. You've got a special kind of disorder. You've got something which had not existed before in this way, which is that human beings are creating societies that are coming up against each other with nothing to regulate their interaction. And that disorder has the name anarchy. It is ungoverned. And the next inevitable step, I'm going to be brief with, but I think it holds water, and it's what Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher who came to a lot of his understanding of the human world by experiencing a situation in England in his 17th century, which was highly anarchic. And he said that the inevitable result of an anarchic system is a war of all against all. And so that's the next step. It is inevitable that a society, that these entities will enter into a state of anarchy. It is inevitable that the state of anarchy will generate a war of all against all. And that means that in such a world, some will prevail in that war, eliminating others or subduing others that are not as well equipped to do well in a war of all against all. And that will be very non-random. Certain ways will survive and spread because the system is anarchic. The anarchy generates a war of all against all, and certain kinds of cultural options better equip a society to do well in such a world. a selective process, which is a function not of the nature of the creature, but of the dynamic of the system that inevitably is created when a form of life gets, a species takes that unprecedented step and leaves the natural order, goes into a disorder that generates a selective process for the things that prevail. Now, I call what prevails power, defining power as basically, if you're in a war of all against all, whatever helps you to survive when in a system so fraught with continual potential and actual strife, that is power enhancing. And there's a selective process that emerges along with civilization that says that these certain power enhancing things will be the future of that civilization. Now, in my lifetime, I've gotten to witness anarchy in two major arenas, one in the late 70s and early 80s in Lebanon, and one in the early 90s in Somalia. In both of them, what had been an order broke down. And then they found themselves in a state of war of all against all. And within a fairly short period of time, those anarchic societies were being dominated by several sets of gangsters. Warlords is the word that's often given. You could see warlords being the main players in Lebanon. And then later you could see warlords, machine guns mounted on jeeps, and this gangster, bunch of gangsters against that bunch of gangsters. So we can see what emerges out of an anarchic situation. A selective process grows out of anarchy, such that it is inevitable that something worth calling the spirit of the gangster will play a disproportionate role in shaping how that world is operating. The spirit of the gangster. That's why any creature on any planet would have to undergo the same destructive and tormented social evolutionary process. That's why. Because the selective process over time is going to make sure that what gets power in a system that's permeated by strife will get that disproportionate say. The gangster. Now, I don't know exactly what human nature is. I've been working at that question for a very long time. But I do know that whether we were as ugly as a lot of people have said that we are, the wolf, selfish, violent, even if we were completely benign in our fundamental nature, and I think we are largely in that direction, but The selective process that I call the parable of the tribes would find within the human system of all the different cultural human possibilities ways of creating whatever is most potent for that, like giving the gangster a whole lot of voice in the future. Because, first of all, we human beings are highly plastic. We can become many things. So you know that if you've got a bunch of societies around the planet evolving in a civilized form, that there will be a whole lot of different human varieties that emerge. There will be traumatic histories that produce human monsters. There will be benign histories that produce wonderful cultures that nurture people, all kinds of things. And that's the other thing that tells you that there's anything that power needs, power is going to find. We are civilization creating creatures because we are creative creatures. We are continually doing things that bring new things into existence, one way or another, for better and for worse. It would be inevitable that a creature that's capable of culture would, when it crossed into civilization, create a huge range of cultural possibilities. I think that's pretty much inevitable. Different groups with different histories, different experiences, creating all kinds of things and coming up with their own ways of understanding the mysteries of their existence, and creating rituals and forms of understanding and symbols, and coming up with different technologies and different ways of organizing themselves, different ways of bringing up kids, different forms of language with different language structures, all kinds of things. At this point, particularly when you cross over the threshold into civilization, where you're not constrained to be continuous with primate hunter-gatherers. Huge range of possibilities, and civilization is developing in an anarchic situation, which says that the ways of power are going to be selected. So what does that mean? Ways of power are going to be selected. Well, one thing important to note, and when I was working on that book, or that 1,600-page dissertation, it was kind of a revelation to me to see power in such a holistic way. I saw that the competitive power of a given society was a function of just about every dimension of the society's of the culture. It's a function of technology, obviously. You can have people with bronze being more powerful than people with just stone tools, and then come the iron. The innovators into iron and rendering bronze obsolete. You can't stand up to iron if all you got in your hand is a bronze sword. The people who domesticated horses became mounted warriors, and those who did not have domesticated the horse couldn't stand up to mounted horses. This is a major division, and so on. And we could go into technology also, like agricultural peoples creating big populations that can support big bureaucracies that can dominate large territories. And they're existing in the same world, like, from the Mediterranean, the Neolithic farmers that we're gradually expanding into a Neolithic Europe, where Neolithic hunter-gatherers were pursuing their own way of life. Well, the technology of agriculture, with all of its innovations, eliminated um, uh, the uh, the previous cultural forms of the hunter-gatherers. Okay, it can be. I'm not going to be able to think of an example of this one, but I know. I remember I documented it. Effective central control, in other words, a political structure. Uh, you are more powerful if it's like in a game of chess. You got one mind directing all the pieces on the chessboard. You're more likely to have a good strategy than if the rooks have their decision making, and the knights have their decision making, and the king and queen don't have control over any of them, and the pawns go. What I'm saying is, the societies with effective central control would be more likely to survive and spread than societies that couldn't marshal the same amount of power out of their more decentralized structure with more local autonomy. Oh, and there's a selection for the psychological structure of the people. There's a whole chapter in that book called Power and the Evolution, the Psychological Evolution of Civilized Man. And I talk about a variety of aspects of how human beings can be socialized. I mean, we can take a whole lot of forms. I'm talking in English because I was born in New Jersey. I'd be speaking Mandarin Chinese if I'd been born someplace else, and there are thousands of other languages. That's just indicative, and I got raised by uh, uh, a modern social scientific father, uh, and a mother who was into theater. We anthropologists have uncovered all forms of human consciousness, and societies can shape our consciousness by all kinds of means, and using channeling itself through the culture, through the family. The parents raise the children to be members of the society. And the psychological structure that creates power, that has actually been something that, well, first of all, it isn't just one structure at any given time. And also, the structure you want for maximizing power in an era of, like the pharaohs, is not necessarily the same way you want to shape the consciousness of people in a modern industrial era. Uh, so we get educated in mathematics and science and things like that because our society needs people who are going to make our economies more dynamic and our weapons more effective. Anyway, it's been a complicated thing. But the basic point is that the way the anarchic system has selecting for certain psychological structures has been non-random, and there have been you can make a case that power has been enhanced by doing things to people that give them a fairly large reservoir of rage. I think you can, I mean, you look at the rise of capitalism, Max Weber, Protestant ethic, and all that. You can make a society more powerful by inculcating in the people a kind of drivenness, a kind of work ethic, which is mighty but tormenting. I think of a quote that I've used more than once from a Protestant theologian named Zinzendorf. We work, and 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 if we don't work, we suffer. There's a need to work as a way of holding off anxiety or uh, guilt or whatever. The selection for power is in some ways selecting for things that you can say are good in some ways. They create certain kinds of order that are, better to live in than disorder. But that which made capitalist nations highly productive connected with a fair amount of self-inflicted human misery. One of the things that's fundamental here, and it's one of the ways the system feeds upon itself, is that we human beings are living in a civilization that's been developing in the direction of power maximization. And what's been selected for includes shaping our psyche, which is very shapeable in ways that involve our internalizing demands that make our societies more competitive, but can be hostile to the needs with which we are born. So what we've got there is a recipe for human suffering because what prevails is what best meets the demands of power, which is not the same as what best meets the needs of people. So what we end up with as a human civilization is not a picture of human nature writ large. It's something that's been shaped by a selective process, which is the fruit of an inevitable systemic dynamic happening at this unprecedented, vital point in the history of life. And we're having to deal with societies that are shaped to meet different needs. The needs of a society that's in a world inevitably beset by a war of all against all. And this is the inevitable consequence of the rise of civilization. It was all there as soon as you step onto the trail and you take some irrevocable step that you're no longer hunter-gatherers in the natural order. Now you're a civilizing creature, inventing your own way of life outside the natural order into this new kind of disorder. Power is irresistible in the way that it spreads. And I'd like to illustrate that with where the actual phrase, the parable of the tribes, comes from. And this is not a model to say this is how it happened, that there was an original bad guy. That's not how it happened. But I'm going to posit a human world where every society wants to live in peace and without there being a agreed upon universal order of a human design, which we're going to need to create, by the way, without there being any kind of enforceable order, still in a state of anarchy, but everybody is of peace on earth, goodwill toward men, uh, you know, except for one. So we can have, let's say we got 20 societies in this cluster, and 19 of them are, singing Kumbaya at the fireside. And then we just got this one who embodies some other human possibility. Let's say we're 19%, 19 parts peacenik and 1% gangster, or 1/20th gangster. Uh, and that's reflected in this original situation. We got this one piece that's hungry for empire, bent upon predation and expansion at the expense of its neighbors. Selfish. No love thy neighbor as thyself. No do unto others. No, I want. So, just 1 out of 20, no problem. We can deal with that. Well, actually, we can't deal with that. Not if every society is sort of sovereign and there is no organization among them. It's not like the body can rally to fight off an infection, and that's the point. Power is going to prove to be a contaminant. It's power that spreads rather than the whole that contains. So, what are the options for these 19 other societies? Now, what the parable of the tribes, it's not really a very good parable, but I was coming from a spiritually aflame place while I was working on this, and the word parable, it was the thing that revealed to me what was the most profound visionary experience I'd ever had. At the age of 24 and still on fire for at least a few years later with it. So I called it a parable. But basically, in a way, it's more like a social scientist with a model or something. So there are 4 options. The first one, bam, the aggressor plunges across the boundary. Hitler invading Poland, and exterminates his neighbors, leaving that territory unpopulated by predecessor, and opening up the territory to be a part of its growing empire. Stage 1, destruction or extermination, whatever you want to call it. Second possibility, the budding imperialist gangster guy plunges, invades the next neighbor, but it's got some new thoughts about how to build its power. And instead of exterminating the people and just taking over its territory, it absorbs the people and the territory. The pages of the ancient world are filled with conquered people becoming a slave class in a growing empire. Isn't that terrible? I mean, isn't that heartbreaking? Hunter-gatherers didn't live like that. But anyway, that's and the conqueror then becomes the ruler. Like Pharaoh over the. I don't know uh, the record of what exactly happened with Hebrews and slaveries and pharaohs. I think is unclear. But in any event, the conqueror has the power not only to enslave people, but to use various forms of coercion to transform the cultures that of the people that they've conquered. I haven't looked into that in any great depth, but you can see that, well, just look what the Spanish did to South American, Central American cultures, spreading Christianity for just a starter. But anyway, so the second option is the growing empire conquers and absorbs. Third option, the next societies that are sort of in the path of the expanding empire, they see what's happened to their neighbors and they want to avoid that fate. But this thing is an empire. They got armies, they got weapons, they got technology. There's nothing they can stand up to. And so they use option 3, which is they leave the area. They go maybe into the Amazon jungle, retreating from territory that used to be theirs. It was part of that original, 19-1 large territory. So they leave their land vacant, and even if they're able to continue more or less in their way, we're focusing on the system that we started with, a group of tribes in a territory within which they're having to interact. And so the empire grows into the abandoned territories of those who have escaped into some remote place. Could be the mountains, could be above the Arctic Circle, some place where they're out of reach and they've left their one-time homeland to the empire. And then there's the fourth option. And it seems to the people who exercise it that in a way this is an option which solves the problem. They don't want to come under the thumb of, or be exterminated or come under the thumb of this guy that's impinging on them. They want to be able to continue to be their own people and run their own society. So they decide they're going to defend themselves. That's what society, that's what much of history is about. Society's trying to defend themselves. But there's a problem. I mean, if the societies are comparable, then defending yourself against a society that's just like yours, well, you can do that. But we're dealing here with evolving systems in which there are societies that are growing empires. And as they grow empires, they're growing their empires because they aren't, just like all the other societies. And the more the empire grows, the more they can make themselves even less like all the other societies. So what the society that wants to defend itself is up against is something that likely has found new springs of power, new cultural innovations that magnify its ability to impose its will on others through force. New technology, all those things that we were talking about before. Work ethic, psychological structures. I mean, they don't have to become identical to the society that threatens them, but they have to build themselves up to a level that's adequate to the task of protecting themselves. I sometimes, back in the 70s, had this metaphor for civilization developing in these various different areas, like Chinese civilization is not the same as as Egyptian civilization. And the civilization of the highlands of Peru is different altogether. And these incredible things that got built up in Guatemala and the Mayans, and they all had to build themselves. They couldn't be a one-story building. Literally and figuratively and metaphorically, they all created temples, governing structures that were reached, like 5 stories above the level of the ground, the pyramids or the temples of Central America, as a metaphor for there being some kind of a universal requirement of how powerful they would be. And you can imagine that somebody who's looking at this pyramid as an emblem of that's what we're up against, and they're living in some kind of a nice grass hut that's big enough to have a good ceremony with drums and dancing. You're not going to stand up to the pyramid with a grass hut. No. In order to defend yourself, if you're up against something that's tapped into some new sources of power, you're going to have to become more like what threatens you. Maybe the same technologies, the arms race. Maybe similar kinds of shaping your people to be fierce fighters. You don't want the kind of people who sit around the campfire singing "Michael, row your boat ashore." I'm dating myself, I know, but you want people who are willing to go out on the battlefield and risk having their heads cut off and be willing to cut other people's heads off. I don't think you get that automatically. But in any event, if the society that's defending itself must, in some meaningful way, emulate the society that threatens it, emulate it at least in the sense of its being shaped to get to a certain level of power, at least to that extent, emulate, then the ways of power are still spreading throughout the system. And even that society, if it's forced to emulate, isn't really able to choose what it might most want to have chosen, which is, please, I'd just like to go along the way I am, your money or your life. That's sort of the choice that societies have faced. Your money meaning change your culture. You gotta forfeit your right to be the way you chose to be, or your life, meaning you're going to get swallowed up in this war of all against all as the ways of power get to survive and spread. That's the parable of the tribes. Any way you go, what started out as a mere contaminant in a larger human system inevitably comes to pervade the whole system. Now, it's not like it happens overnight. 16 teams get into the NCAA tournament, and in a schedule of several weeks, it gets winnowed down by halves again and again, and then you got a winner. And that's the spirit of the gangster. No, but this goes on over millennia. It's not a systematic tournament, but there is no stopping it. Even whatever happens, like for centuries, there might be peace, but eventually the bill comes due. You need to have among all the cultural options, only those that can pay the bill of the power necessary to survive will be part of the human future. And that is an inevitable consequence of the step onto the path of civilization. And that's what people haven't, I don't think that people haven't seen, and I think it is vital to see it. One immediately understands we're not the creatures we have thought ourselves to be. Our societies have sold us a bill of goods which made a lot of sense given the ugliness we see in human history. We've been told about original sin, and we live in a culture right now where if somebody says, well, that's human nature, they're always pointing to some defect in our nature. Well, we do have a lot of defects. I wish I was less aware of my own. But I'm kind of okay with myself. I've worked hard to make myself less defective over the years. But there are a lot of ways of being more whole than I am. And I can see that I am the heir of a lot of history that contributes to the ways the life has been a struggle for me that are sort of a function of my own defect. And I can see it in our world in general. We are living in a world that was continuously shaped by the demands of power to a very great extent. It's not that human needs have been irrelevant, particularly for people like us who are living in a comparatively free and comparatively affluent society. In the big picture of what human beings have lived in the last 10 or 12,000 years, I consider myself and I consider us among the most fortunate of human beings that there have been. I mean, it's hard to entirely compare different sets of goods, but I think we're pretty fortunate. But you can look at human history and you can see that there's no guarantee that the evolutionary process will take people in a direction which serves human needs. It serves human, the mass of people, and 5,000 years into the civilizing process, were living lives as slaves. And scientific studies can show that they were actually eating worse than their hunting-gathering ancestors. It was not a step forward for the mass of human beings to go into the process of the evolution of civilization governed by the parable of tribes. I think it's quite clear that the life of hunter-gatherers was in some fundamental ways superior to that of their ancestors in the early civilized world. If we've made some progress, and I think we have, in creating free societies where there's a fair amount of attention to meeting human needs, way more than the slaves got in ancient empires, I think that that's a sign that we have capacities to bring some of these forces under control. But we have a very long way to go. And we are in danger of not making it as we enter into a phase of civilization where we have the capacity to destroy ourselves. So the process in which this destructive force has been unleashed in the civilized world, that doesn't reflect human nature all that well, but does reflect the dynamics of the system. That has created a challenge for us as a species, that we bring the brokenness that got unleashed under control before we destroy ourselves with the war of all against all, and that anarchy leading ultimately to some kind of nuclear holocaust between major nuclear powers. Or that this system that broke out of the natural order becomes such a huge bull in the biospheric china shop that it brings the systems of life down upon its head through things like climate disruption. So it is important for us to see that we're in a situation, we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. That's not our ugliness we see. And that any creature would have put itself in this mess that we find ourselves in. And the challenge is to understand why we're in the mess, what forces are still operating in our world that are threatening to drive us to self-destruction, and to bring them under control. And those are some of the pieces that I'm going to be fleshing out in the rest of this Better Human story. But the first thing, this foundational idea is, if we look at the unprecedented step we took, we can see the unprecedented nature of the situation that we plunged inadvertently into. And we can begin to see the inevitable forces that get unleashed into the human world that need to be brought under control. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Hope you'll tune in for some of the rest of this picture. Bye-bye.